Hello, philosophers, and welcome to our next lecture for Introduction to Philosophy and Christian Thought. Today I want to do a couple things. First, I want to address an issue that really is critical to this study, and that is the relationship between philosophy and Christian thought. And then secondly, we're going to talk a little bit about Plato's Apology. Okay, first subject at hand, the relationship between philosophy and Christian thought. Now, in a previous lecture, I introduced the study of philosophy, and I kind of hinted at what it means to engage in particularly Christian philosophy. But today I want to talk about how Christian philosophy relates to pagan Greek philosophy, how Christian philosophy relates to postmodern secular philosophy, or Islamic philosophy, or really any worldview other than that of the Christian. Now, this is a potentially difficult issue that's been discussed since the earliest days of the New Covenant community. And so let's just consider a couple church fathers for representatives of a couple different perspectives. Okay, first I want to refer you to the church father Tertullian, who in Against Heresies famously wrote the following: "What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What concord is there between the academy and the church? What between heretics and Christians? Our instruction comes from the porch of Solomon, who had taught that the Lord should be sought in simplicity of heart. Away with all attempts to produce a model Christianity of Stoic, Platonic, and dialectic composition. We want no curious disputation after possessing Christ Jesus, no inquisition after enjoying the gospel. With our faith, we desire no further belief, for this is our primary faith, that there is nothing which we ought to believe besides." So Tertullian comes out with this rather strong opposition between biblical thought and non-biblical thought. What has Athens, this city of human reason, have to do with Jerusalem, the city of revelation? And so here we have this rather kind of combative attitude that of necessity views secular philosophy as being at odds with biblical Christian thought. Now, on the other extreme side of the spectrum, we have Origen of Alexandria, who wrote in his Trimata, "For clearly, as I think, he showed that the one and only God was known by Greeks in a Gentile way, by the Jews Judaically, and in a new spiritual way by us. And further, that the same God that furnished both the covenants was the giver of Greek philosophy to the Greeks, by which the Almighty is glorified among the Greeks, he shows." So Origen goes so far as to say that God revealed himself to the Jews through the covenant of Moses, and to a similar degree, he revealed himself to the Greeks through the covenant of philosophy. And so here, Origen esteems the philosophy of the Greeks so much as to at least nearly put it on the same level as special prophetic revelation. And so the Jews had their prophets and the Greeks had their philosophers. Now, it's possible, especially if you've never really considered these ideas before, that you are naturally gravitating more towards Tertullian or towards Origen here. And it's not my objective to tell you what position is right. However, I would suggest to you a third approach. And this is an approach that we see through Justin Martyr, as well as Augustine and a host of others throughout the history of Christian philosophy. And this is the view that all truth is God's truth wherever it can be found. Because you see, both the Christian and the non-Christian alike are created in God's image, and they're created in a world that testifies to its creator. And just take a look at Romans 1, as well as many other places in Scripture that demonstrate this fact, that creation itself testifies to the reality of its creator, and that the image bearers of this creator cannot help but on some level recognize and build their lives on this reality, even if with their thoughts, words, and actions, they very frequently contradict this reality. In fact, this is why Paul says in Romans 1 that people are given over to foolish and futile thinking, because on some level they know the truth about the world in which they live that is reflective of its creator. And so when they deny that, they're caught up in all kinds of contradictions and darkened thinking. But because they know the truth, they very often will come to understand and articulate true things to greater or lesser degrees. For example, Augustine greatly esteemed Plato, and so he would frequently esteem Plato while maintaining that he needs to be sifted through Scripture to see what's worth keeping and what's not. Likewise, Thomas Aquinas would refer to Aristotle as the philosopher because he believed that Aristotle used his reason well to arrive at a great many truths regarding the nature of reality and logic and virtue. And so this is really where I approach this topic. I believe that all people are created in God's image, and that means that they're capable of using their reason, as flawed and misdirected as it may be, in order to achieve great and glorious and commendable things with their minds. And so I think that we would be foolish and really bad stewards of wisdom to neglect that. In fact, a number of times we see that Paul himself was intentionally educated in the non-Christian world. And consider the fact that when he's arguing with the philosophers, with the Stoics and Epicureans and others at Mars Hill in Athens, he's able to cite their poets reflexively and then just sort of reorient their direction towards the true God. And so we see that there is biblical precedence for understanding and utilizing unbelieving, secular, pagan thought. In fact, I would argue that it's often beneficial for us to study brilliant, unbelieving thinkers because they're so outside of our typical bubbles that they might give us insights or challenge our thinking in ways that would not normally happen within our normal ecclesial walls. And so I don't believe that we should shut down the unbeliever simply because they're an unbeliever. Instead, what we need to do is consider the ideas that they're speaking and ask ourselves, do these ideas carry with them truth, goodness, and beauty, despite the espoused worldview of the person professing them? Just as we should not accept, embrace, and promote ideas just because they're spoken by a Christian. I mean, a lot of Christians believe and act upon a lot of bad ideas. And so we should be more concerned with truth, goodness, and beauty than we are with the person who is speaking. And now I want to talk to you a little bit about Plato's Apology, which you should have read last week. Now, the version that I posted on Blackboard comes from this Plato 5 Dialogues, translated by Grube, revised by Cooper. And these 5 dialogues together, the Euthyphro, Apology, Credo, Meno, and Phaedo, all together create what's usually referred to as the trial and death of Socrates. These are critical philosophical texts. I would strongly encourage you to get a copy of this. I believe they're pretty cheap. And give a read to all 5 dialogues. But for now, I'm just going to briefly touch on some elements from the Apology. This is not going to be a comprehensive analysis. I'm really just going to pick out a few things that I think are worth mentioning, and then we'll likely discuss it some more in our class Zoom meeting. And perhaps the first thing worth mentioning is the title. I'm sure many of you know this, but this is not called an apology because Plato or Socrates are trying to say that they're sorry for something. Right? This comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a reasoned defense. It's where we get our word apologetics. And so Socrates is attempting to give a reasoned defense against the charges that are brought against him, which then leads to our next question. What were the charges that were brought against Socrates? Well, Socrates points out that there are 2 charges. He has these earlier accusations and then the later or more recent accusations. So the earlier charge that's been brought against him is that he really only has the appearance of wisdom, that he lacks substance. He's just a master of rhetoric. He's a wordsmith. He's a rhetorician for hire, like the sophists. Now, the sophists are people you should already be kind of familiar with from from reading about Protagoras. Remember, he's the one who said that man is the measure of all things. That's because the sophists were essentially relativists, right? They didn't believe in absolute truth. They weren't seeking the true. They weren't seeking the good. What they were seeking is the power of words. And so they would sell their skills as rhetoricians to nobles and lawyers, to budding politicians, so that they would be more effective in using their words to advance their ambitions. Now, because of their kind of mercenary, wisdom-opposing tendencies, the sophistry has really become a bad word or an insult in the world of philosophy. You don't typically want to be labeled a sophist, because what that means is you don't really have any substance. You're just, at best, a wizard of words. And I use that word intentionally because really I think sophistry has a lot in common with witchcraft. Right? The idea behind witchcraft is that you're going to use your words to bend reality to your will. Right? That's why you have these incantations, these spells, and really that's the idea behind sophistry, that you're attempting to use your words not to point others towards truth, towards goodness, towards the ideal, towards beauty, but instead you are trying to use your words to bend reality to your will, right? Because man is the measure of all things, and so the sophist is attempting to use his words to measure reality against himself. And I don't think it's difficult to find examples of sophistry in our own contemporary discourse. Right? I mean, just consider politicians or really so many of our thought leaders or cultural leaders. Right? They're typically not concerned with the true and the good. They're typically concerned with bending popular support around their ambition. Whereas people of genuine substance are often found a little closer to the ground. And as Solomon says, there's nothing new under the sun. And so don't think that sophistry is at all a modern invention. In fact, Socrates himself says, "In my investigation of the service of the god, I found that those who had the highest reputation were the most efficient, while those who were thought to be inferior were more knowledgeable." And so Socrates says that even in his day, right, if you want to find those who truly know something worthwhile, right, don't go to those blue check marks on Twitter. Don't go to your politicians. Don't go to those who our vain, superficial culture tends to hold in high esteem. If you want wisdom, very often you have to look to the lowly. Perhaps even more important, you yourself have to become lowly. Right? The reason why Socrates supposedly had this great wisdom is because he didn't believe that he actually knew anything. And so he had wisdom because he recognized he needed to seek wisdom from beyond himself, whereas those who foolishly claimed to have wisdom weren't looking. And so that's really his defense against the first charge. Well, for one, he says that, unlike the sophist, he didn't charge anyone for his teaching, and so he wasn't earning a profit off of what he was saying. And then secondly, unlike the sophist, he was seeking wisdom instead of claiming to possess it. Okay, and so then he addresses his more recent charges levied against him by this guy Miletus. And so these more recent charges involved corrupting the youth and atheism. Now, if you read these 5 dialogues, you perhaps can start to kind of understand why Socrates was charged with atheism, because he does not seem to really hold in high esteem the gods of the Greek pantheon. Instead, he's looking for something a little bit more simple, as in he's looking for the good, not just the politics of the gods. However, he's certainly not an atheist, because he indicates that he clearly believes in spiritual realities, and so the charge of atheism can be dismissed rather easily for Socrates. Now, the next charge is corrupting the youth. And then basically to this, he says that Miletus and these various other people who are bringing accusations against him have no idea what is actually good for the youth. In other words, they see Socrates as this troublemaker who's leading the youth astray, but they don't have any clear vision of what it means to be on the right path. And so this is really a political show trial more than a substantive concern for the youth of Athens. And Socrates says just as much. He says, you have made it sufficiently obvious, Miletus, that you have never had any concern for our youth, and you show your indifference clearly, that you have given no thought to the subjects about which you bring me to trial. And so he basically says, okay, Miletus, you have no idea what the good is. You have no idea what is good for humanity. You have no idea what is good for the youth, yet you charge me with corrupting the youth. And so Socrates really gets at the core of the issue and recognizes that the people of Athens are just trying to cancel him because he's disturbing their vain, superficial, unexamined lives. And Socrates explains that if they were to exile him or just command him not to teach anymore, that he couldn't do that because he is so concerned with the good. He is so concerned with wisdom. He is so concerned with disturbing the complacency of those around him that it would be impossible for him to stop philosophizing. In fact, I kind of see a corollary here between Socrates and the apostles in Acts, right? When they're brought to court for preaching Christ, they make it very clear that no matter what the court does to them, they're just going to keep going about their business because they have to share the good news. They have to use their words to shake the complacency of the sinners around them, that they might come to know truth and goodness manifested in the gospel. And so too, Socrates is acting as an evangelist or an apologist for wisdom who can't shut up because he identifies his very being with wisdom, with truth, with goodness. Now, I'm not saying that Socrates is an apostle, but I'm trying to help you see why Socrates never really makes an attempt to acquit himself. And in fact, he goes not to say that he's not going to make this into some dramatic affair. He's not going to bring his kids before the court to show that they're going to be losing their father if he's put to death. He's not going to shed tears. He's not going to plead for sympathy. He's going to use the entirety of his life, however short it might be cut at this point, to testify to wisdom. In fact, he says here, someone might say, are you not ashamed, Socrates, to have followed the kind of occupation that has led to your being now in danger of death? However, I should be right to reply to him, you are wrong, sir, if you think that a man who is any good at all should take into account the risk of life or death. He should look to this only in his actions, whether what he does is right or wrong, whether he is acting like a good man or a bad man. And then he goes on to say that nobody can actually do anything to harm a good man, because goodness itself is his health, and that cannot be taken away from an external source. And so whether they were to exile him, whether they were to banish him, or whether they are to execute him, they can do nothing to take away his goodness, because that comes from an inner condition of the soul. And so he suggests that if they kill him, maybe he'll go to Hades and talk to Homer and some of the other great Greek heroes, or maybe he'll just die and enter into an eternal slumber. But no matter what awaits him on the other side of the grave, he's convinced that the court can do nothing to harm him because goodness itself is his health. And if only we as Christians were so bold to identify ourselves with goodness against a culture set against us, to the point where we don't cling so much to our political rights as we do to our Christ, and we use every opportunity, even at our own physical and socioeconomic peril, to demonstrate the value of truth and goodness of integrity, of a soul set on the path of wisdom. So this is the quote that I want to end with. So Socrates, at this point, he has been condemned to death by the court of Athens, and this is what he has to say. You too must be of good hope as regards death, gentlemen of the jury, and keep this one truth in mind, that a good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death, and that his affairs are not neglected by the gods. Okay, as I said, we're going to discuss this more during our upcoming class Zoom meeting, but for now, I pray that you go in wisdom and ever increasingly come to identify with goodness.